Svana took up the scroll and wound the wooden spools to read. Objective imagination, social. The consideration of the interactive context in the development of the organism requires the development of the means by which to describe and understand the present condition, consideration of how investment of intent should be prioritized in terms of its purpose, and consideration of the threat of subjective intent to both innate and objective requirements. These considerations take into account the conflict between subjective and objective intent in interactive development, specifically in the context of desire-based and need-based markets, and in the application of rule and principle-based control elements in the generating of the potential for individualized objective intent. Present consideration. Science. Scientific method, observable and reproducible data. The application of controlled stress requires rational method. Rational method develops out of the imposition of subjective relative manipulation. As a subjective organism recognizes pattern in its ability to manipulate itself as well as aspects of its environment, it realizes the first stage of rational consideration towards the objective, an awareness of the mechanism's interrelation as they actually are, as well as the predictive ability based on observed pattern to consider potential states that might be achieved. This stage is the point where the organism begins to realize the difference between subjective understanding and objective understanding. The development of rationality requires the distinction be made with discipline. Discipline in this context is the separation of the subjective and the objective. It is the defining of what is objectively known and the removal of that from the subjective context, so to be protected as a resource within the provisioning environment. The organism recognizes that by developing its objective understanding of itself and its environment as separated from subjective intent, it may further develop objective understanding to increase the efficiency and the extent of the manipulative ability of the organism. The organism, in recognizing the value of its ability to manipulate, in realizing the value of the objective method, in devoting its rationality to protecting the purity of its newfound kernel of understanding, employs humility in following the development of that understanding. The humility is in the separation within itself of the subjective and objective forces of intent. It is a submission of the subjective identification of the organism, with its inherently perceived interests, to the objective. The organism spites its subjective intent in order to give willing precedence to something outside of itself, but which contains itself, that may or may not align with or support the organism's currently perceived subjective interest. The humility is in the organism recognizing its subjective fallibility. It is in the organism realizing the need to apply the rational process so as to test every aspect of its understanding. It is in the separation of itself from itself so as to perceive all from an alternate, more reliable position. It is to challenge its understanding, to apply controlled stress to its understanding, to seek out the weaknesses within its understanding, to correct those weaknesses so as to strengthen its understanding. Scientific method, structural benefit. In distilling knowledge from subjective supposition, the organism recognizes a structure of understanding separated from the distorting fields of subjective intent. The distillation of knowledge requires a separation of the emotive response mechanism from the process. The separation is necessary in order to allow the removal of subjective intent until the emotive response mechanism can be recalibrated to allow the rational process to take place in as pure a form as possible. Once the organism is trained to the discipline, it may better perceive the difference in subjective and objective intent and purpose. Then intent and purpose may be applied in correct conjunction to inform the future development of the structure of understanding. Once separation has taken place, the body of objective knowledge may start to grow. As each facet is observed and tested, it is added to the body of understanding. But while the body of understanding becomes, for purposes of the organism, a resource in the organism's provisioning environment, the object of the understanding, the structure of manifestation and its interrelation is exposed, observed, and recorded. With each new instigation of controlled purpose and observation, additional facets become apparent, which in turn must be understood through the same process. In this way, the organism comes to observe the objective reality of its environment, the structure of its provisioning, and how it itself fits into a larger context of interconnected manifestation. The recording of disciplined observation allows the passage of understanding to spread collectively within the organism until it becomes positively systemic, until each part of the organism may develop and share its own particular rational observations with the collective for purposes of collective advancement. Analytic advancement, relevance of application. This process of developing objective understanding based on rational observations separated from the emotive mechanism constitutes analytic advancement. Through analytic advancement, the organism may develop the discipline by which to recalibrate the emotive response mechanism to objective consideration. This development is necessary for the transcendence of analytic advancement in pursuit of directed knowledge. Analytic advancement is the process by which awareness of structural elements give rise to awareness of further structural elements through their interconnection in the environment. The organism, in observing elements, records them and then follows to the connected next to record that. The process governs the knowledge gained. The organism applies its rational consideration to all that presents for its application. Gradually, the organism develops increased comprehension of its environment and increased ability to manipulate its environment to its collective purpose. Analytic advancement, structural limitation. The process of analytic advancement sets aside the emotive response mechanism so as to develop discipline and objective reliability in its recording. In setting aside the emotive response mechanism, the organism sets aside all intent beyond the analytic advancement of its comprehension of its environment. In time, the organism realizes that analytic advancement will pertain to comprehension of whatever it takes as its object of view. The process of viewing and testing necessarily brings further considerations to be taken into account. In analyzing the object, the organism realizes further objects to view. In time, the diversity of awareness within the organism builds. It first uncovers the more immediate, both in breadth and depth, and then it moves on to the more remote, both in breadth and depth. As the structure and manifestation of the organism and its environment are infinite, the organism, itself finite as defined, realizes it must prioritize its pursuit. In recognizing the benefit of prioritization, the organism realizes a choice. At this stage, the organism is at risk. Where retained subjective intent is latent, that intent may rise to take advantage of the developed awareness in the employment of increased manipulative ability in service to the subjective intent. Alternatively, the organism may retain discipline and apply it not only in its analysis of its environment, but also in the context of developing awareness of the value scale to be employed if it is to realize further collective gains. The value scale must realize the actual requirements of the organism. It must allow the organism to direct its investigation most efficiently to build awareness where awareness will be most beneficial to the organism. The development of the value scale involves the recalibration of and the reintroduction of the emotive response mechanism. The emotive response, calibrated to a rational comprehension of environment, gives rise to the ability for the full use of applied imagination. Applied imagination is the mechanism by which objectives that take perception of potential into account may be established. In considering potential, the emotive mechanism is calibrated to respond in aid of the realization of potential. To realize potential, the organism must apply imagination to consider the form of that potential, and then must rationally derive from that form, to the extent it can, the principles at play that would be required to allow it. In consideration of the principles, the emotive mechanism is guided to establish expectation consistent with the principles. This calibration then may be used to guide the analytical process towards awareness that is consistent with bringing about the imagined objective state, the state of perceived potential. Objective imagination, social, present consideration, arts. Subjectivity and objectivity, relative. Applied imagination, like analytic advancement, must be directed according to a scale of value. Value is the representation of the relative importance attributed by the organism to the object it considers. In the context of limited comprehension, the determination of value may be calibrated towards any position on the continuum between extreme subjective intent and relative objective intent. The nature of the organism's manipulations will reflect the position on the continuum to which they are directed. Where the organism reflects greater subjectivity, it leans towards valuation of the subjective. Where the organism reflects greater objectivity, it leans toward valuation of the objective. In either case, it empowers that which it reflects by manifesting it in the environment. All that is manifested expresses its nature in its environment. To the extent the expression is heard or interacted with, it brings its influence to bear. The organism, employing manipulation magnified by purpose developed in the imagination, adds to the manifestation to which other organisms respond. Manipulation thus bears a seed responsibility for the benefits resulting from the manipulation, as well as for the costs. Because of this, the organism must consider carefully how it manipulates its environment. At the innate level, the organism shifts its immediate environment in superficial respects for its purpose specifically as a result of and to the extent of the form and requirements of its inherent manifestation. At the subjective level, the manipulation is influenced by the organism's increased recognition of self-interest and increased recognition of its manipulative ability, but limited regard for the collective. At the rational subjective level, the organism realizes it may benefit from subjective intent, and its manipulations only to the extent it also governs subjective intent and its manipulations for collective purpose. At the relative objective level, the organism collectively internalizes the principles of the objective and employs the imagination to consider manipulations designed to project efforts beyond its actual immediate perceptive ability in time. Where the manipulation is collective, it has immediate systemic effect. In the case of a distortion of intent within the relative objective context, where subjective intent is allowed to supersede collective intent, and the systemic effect is employed towards subjective purpose, the cohesion of the collective organism, the integrity of the collective organism, is immediately corroded to the extent of the manipulation. The subjective recognizes its mortality. The subjective reflects upon the organism as it is while retracting attention from the potential objective state. Its reference to its own innate survival instinct is the driving force that causes it to override the collective, where it sees the collective would put it at risk. The more the subjective identifies with its state, the more its emotive response mechanism is calibrated towards the maintenance of that state. The emotive response mechanism, in that case, regresses to its innate state, but does so in the relative objective context. In that dichotomy of purpose, collective manipulations towards objectives become recognized by the entity as threats to that with which it identifies, and thereby as threats to its own identity. On a relative scale, the subjective thus leans towards the finite, where the objective leans towards the infinite. The subjective, in attempting to avoid its own perceived sense of irrelevance, mistakenly pursues that which increases its irrelevance. By failing to identify with the objective, the position of collective relevance in an expanded temporal context, it limits its relevance over time. Subjectivity and objectivity, absolute. The intent of any given collective organism is not necessarily more objective than the intent of a given organism that may count as a part of the collective. The collective organism perceives and acts to the objective extent of the balance of its constituent influences. Those influences, as a matter of intent, range infinitely from the most objectively embodied within the collective to the most subjectively embodied within the collective. The extents actually manifested constitute the boundaries that define the outer extents of the collective intent. Where the extent of subjective intent retracts in the reflective organism, the more intent may be brought to bear towards the objective intent. The collective organism is affected by the same dynamics of intent as the individual organism. Each is a collective of varying intents and acts ultimately according to their balance. For the individual organism to internalize the objective, it is insufficient to simply join the collective. The allegiance of the individual cannot be to the collective. Unlike the subjective collective, this objective collective is determined not through collective coercion or manipulated obedience, but through active, concerted, individual intent towards accordance with the principles that define the objective interest and that are held in common. The individual must understand the intent of the objective to the extent it can perceive the principles required to be met by that objective and that define the realization of that objective. This individualized internalization is what prevents the collective from itself succumbing to a regression into collective subjectivity. Collective subjectivity is the state in which the collective organism, despite having achieved the ability for rational consideration, and despite having achieved the ability for the determination of abstract objectives, comes to identify with itself as a result of its prior achievements, instead of continuing to identify with the objectives that allowed those achievements. Thus, the collective potential is subject to the individual in terms of both threat and benefit. The collective corrodes as a result of the regression of constituent individuals into the rule of subjective intent. The collective is empowered by the intent of those of its constituents that have internalized understanding of the objective and projected their influence towards the objective. In order for the individual to internalize the objective, it must understand the objective within the context of an overall scale by which to make comparison as to value. At the rational subjective level, the individual organism considers the immediate manifestation within its environment and makes judgment according to the scale that it perceives to be evidenced. At the relative objective level, the individual may see beyond that which is evidenced to determine objectives that are not evidenced, but which are abstractly perceivable. The individual is not able to perceive the absolute, but the individual must project itself in an attempt to perceive the absolute if it wishes to avoid an application of individual subjective intent that contributes to a collective regression towards a more subjective collective state. In projecting to perceive the absolute, the individual organism must employ directed imagination, to the extent of its ability, to abstract to the core of the unification and explosion of collective principle. To abstract to the core of the unification and explosion of collective principle, the organism must consider the subjective in the absolute and the objective in the absolute. The extents of the perception achieved towards each are the guide points against which all collective approaches towards the objective must be judged. With those guide points in mind, the individual organism attends itself to manipulating all within its scope of influence towards the absolute objective. Within the interactivity of the collective, the result is balanced against the efforts of others, and the power of influence is determined by articulation, the extent of expressive ability, and empathy, the extent of communicative ability. Quality of expression, articulation. As the extent of expressive ability, articulation represents the embodiment of current objective intent. Articulation represents the internalization of principle, such as to provide newly embodied manifestation with expressive capacity by which it may describe and represent a facet of the articulating organism's objective intent. Articulation consists of structure and the content that applies to the structure. Correct articulation requires the organism to match the articulation of the objective to the extent possible. Through pursuit of the objective, by alignment with the principles dictated by the nature of the objective, the organism develops its awareness of the content of the objective and what that content necessitates in terms of the underlying structure that must apply. The underlying structure consists of principles with specific requirements. Different structures give rise to different content. The objective is the form for the principle is the form for the structure is the form for the content. The content is the expression within the environment of the structure. The objective can be seen through the expression the content manifests. Articulation requires not simply the mimicking of content, but also the understanding of structure. The integrity of the understanding of the expression of the content is in the internalization of the underlying form. Once the underlying form has been correctly internalized by the articulating entity, then its own expression matches in its logic the expression of the objective sought. At that point, the articulating organism has become the objective. In actuality, the objective may never be gained by the articulating organism, so long as the articulating organism regresses to subjectivism. By regressing to subjectivism, the articulating organism retreats its perception from the extent of what it can see, faintly in the distance, to that which it can see clearly in the present. In taking security from what is known, the articulating organism stagnates on the assumption that present conditions shall remain constant. Even where the articulating organism recognizes the inevitable change that will take place, requiring a reconfiguration of structure, the articulating organism must consider that the longer it remains reliant on the security of its apparent subjective security, the greater the force of inertia will become. The articulating organism must reset objectives consistently. The resetting of objectives must match the state of constancy of relevance of the objective in question. Only distant objectives may be kept with relative constancy. All intervening objectives must be allowed to shift with the requirements of the patterns within the context of the organism's environment. The interest cannot be in the intervening objectives as once considered. The interest must be in the intervening objectives as they appear in the most complete perspective of the subjective to objective value scale available to the organism at every step in its development towards the objective. This perspective must take into account the consistent fluctuation of the reach of perception. As the extent of perception fluctuates, the articulating organism responds by considering what it may consider in the circumstances. Where retractions of perception take place, the articulation must reset to known principle in order to maintain quality of expression. The articulation of expression is a force limiter or a force multiplier. Quality of expression requires a consideration of the result of the expression's influence. On the subjective scale, this means consideration of the extent to which the expression matches the intent of the subjective interest. On the objective scale, this means the extent to which the expression matches the intent of objective interest. If subjective interest is articulated well, its force of intent will be more greatly apparent and potentially more greatly influential in its environment. Subjective interest is not aligned with objective interest, even where it seems to be consistent. Because the intent is misaligned, the form is different. Because the form is different, even if the content seems similar, it will evolve differently. While manifested, the articulating organism is not able to fully divest itself of subjective interest. Even while pursuing objective interest, the articulating organism must maintain itself within its subjective environment. Three interactive states apply: the interaction between the organism and the objective, the interaction within the organism as it generates its articulation within its own comprehension, and the interaction between the organism and its environment. The objective grows in influence with the energy afforded it through the consideration of the organism. The objective is a force itself in the manifested environment. It exists, at least as an abstract potential within the environment, so long as its strength may possibly be grown. The articulation of the organism becomes that on which it feeds. That is because the organism articulates inevitably what it consists of. The organism is an expression of the content that is applicable to its own underlying form. The organism must determine at what point the maintenance of those aspects of its form are reliant on the subjective force. The individual organism is reliant on the subjective force to the extent it must interact for provisioning with the subjective force within the context of the collective organism. The subjective force in this context is the extent to which provisioning manifestation within the collective organism diverges from the individual organism's own comprehension of required objective principle. Maintaining provisioning relationships requires articulation of applicable forms and content. Where the difference increases between the articulation required by the objective and the articulation required by the provisioning collective organism, the individual organism must bifurcate itself to the extent possible until the benefit of maintaining the articulation expected by the collective organism is exceeded by its cost. To the extent it may, the individual organism can attend to influencing the collective organism towards the objective. In order to influence towards the objective, the individual must become the objective through articulation. The individual articulating organism packages and provides a representation of the form and content of the objective in the immediate interactive context in order to trigger consistent response in its environment. Quality of expression, empathy. In the internal space of the individual organism, the quality of the expression of the objective is limited or propelled by the ability of the organism to accurately articulate the form and content of the objective for its own consideration. Where the individual organism must interact with the collective organism for purposes of provisioning, the quality of the expression of the objective is also reliant on the ability of the articulating organism to express enough of what is between the objective and the individual state of other individual organisms, those with which it interacts within the collective state, to make possible a perception of content that is sufficient to bring about in the receiving organisms the contemplation of form necessary to trigger internalization of form through accordance with the principles of form entails. Empathy is to understand the structure of what underlies the content of the receiving organism. It is to see beneath the content so as to avoid assumption regarding the content. Through applying to content alone, the articulating organism assumes an underlying structure rather than verifies it. While there may be grounds to presume an underlying form on the basis of content, care must be taken to avoid allowing assumption. Different forms with different intents may give rise to superficially similar content. The function of interactive articulation requires the form of the articulation to mesh with the extents of the receptive comprehension of the receiving organism. Meshing requires a meeting. Its value is located in the drawing of the collective towards the collective through individual intention rather than through collective coercion. The meshing of individual intents is the body of the collective. Where meshing does not take place, it means either the individual or the collective has gone astray from the principle of the objective. In either case, the determination must be made by each which is the more correct to the objective, to what extent the other is incorrect, whether a new meeting may be accomplished, and what negotiation and resulting compromise or sacrifice would be required to allow a re-establishment of meshing to take place. Empathetic consideration need not govern articulation, but for negotiation to take place it is required. To the extent it is within the interest of the articulating organism to maintain negotiation, it must, as a matter of function alone, allow for the consideration. Within the construct of interrelation that defines a collective, negotiation is constant. So long as the articulating organism relies on the collective for provisioning, it must negotiate. Negotiation results in compromise or in sacrifice. Compromise in negotiation is the articulation of what is required to meet and weave with the other different but consistent intent of other individual organisms within the collective in order to allow a collective result that manifests the intent of both the interacting organisms. Sacrifice in negotiation is the submission of the objective to the subjective, where empathy in expression results in the strengthening of the subjective to the cost of the objective, rather than the developing of the subjective towards the objective. Sacrifice has taken place. The sacrifice is the corrosion of the integrity of the collective organism. Empathy in that case is extended from understanding to assimilation. The sacrifice is in the giving up of individual intent for the intent of another, regardless of the objective interest, and solely on the basis of subjective influence. The compassion that underlies the meshing shifts from understanding and support through willing compromise that is consistent with mutual intent towards a collective objective, to compassion as regards the subjective interest of the other. The other can be another individual organism, or a collective of organisms of which the articulating organism is a part. The sacrifice is evidenced to the extent the articulation of the organism shifts its form and content away from the objective and towards the subjective intent with which it interacts. The subjective intent assimilates the expressive energy and diverts it from direct consideration of the collective objective. Empathy in expression thus needs to be directed to the objective and to others only to the extent they themselves observe the objective and recognize the correlation of intents in the adherence to principle as a result of consistent internalized structure. This establishment of empathy is fundamental to the calibration of the emotive response mechanism. It is the drawing into the locality of experience, the internalized comprehension of the structure behind manifested form. It is the identification of mutual interest and mutual interactive value, and it is the internalization of that identification in order to incentivize mutual support. Empathy in expression, compromise in articulation, therefore is valuable to the extent it acts in support of objective rather than subjective interest within the collective organism. Objective imagination, social, present application, business, free market development, desire-based market. The content in which negotiation and exchange takes place is the provisioning market. At the innate level, the provisioning market necessarily takes into account innate requirements and is provided by the provisioning environment in its raw form. At the subjective level, the provisioning market remains in its raw form, but is to some extent manipulated to subjective intent as a result of the development of reflective awareness in the organism. The manipulation of the provisioning market channels the provisioning force to the intent of the subjective organism. This manipulation increases the extent and the efficiency by which the objective organism is provisioned. Manipulation to subjective intent magnifies adversarial competition for finite resources. Where adverse subjective interests conflict, friction is created. In the adversarial subjective context, the cost of the friction is automatically externalized to the extent possible. The rational function develops in the collective bearers of the externalized cost to counteract further development of externalized cost. With that rational function comes into play the objective of establishing a state that is able to avoid such friction in the future. In establishing that state, the rational function develops systems to manage the allocation of provisioning. The requirements of the individual organism are no longer supplied by the provisioning environment in its raw form. Instead, the individual organism becomes part of the collective organism it is born into, and the collective organism itself becomes the provisioning environment. Where subjective interests present, and to the extent they persist, they extend influence into the market in order to draw provisioning to reinforce and strengthen their interests. In order to strengthen their interests, they apply empathy to others in the market. By understanding the requirements of others in the market, the subjective interest may extend itself to provide for those requirements. To the extent the market is innate or objective, it is need-based. To the extent the market is subjective, it is desire-based. The subjective interest recognizes that if the market is limited to the innate or to the objective, then the market is restricted, and the extent of its ability to draw from it is limited. In order to overcome this limitation, the subjective recognizes the role of the emotive mechanism and how, in the absence of rational governance, the emotive mechanism can be manipulated to give rise to the emotive experience of need. The subjective interest, through empathetic consideration of the subjective aspect of the collective, encourages the calibration of the emotive mechanism towards the normalization of consumption of that which is provided, regardless of innate or objective need. In this case, the subjective intent promotes, establishes, and reinforces the calibration of emotive response in those seeking their provision in the market to respond to desire, as based in subjective interest, to the extent it can be established. Except to the extent limited as a result of rational governance or integrity towards objective, the emotive mechanism continues to shift in calibration with each generation to allow further development of market investment in the content created through structures representing subjective intent. The subjective market, focused on subjective intent, is based in the present. Its time horizon takes into account what the market may be manipulated to require within the fleeting context necessary to keep awareness from re-establishing itself towards the satisfaction of innate and objective needs. Subjective intent applies itself to innate intent in that it functions through application to the survival instinct in the organism. It reinforces a sense of security that counteracts the threat to innate security by manipulating the emotive response through application to the precariousness of innate provision. By manipulating the market through empathetic understanding, the subjective reminds the market of its mortality, while simultaneously providing the means to distract from it. In order for subjective growth to develop in the market, the satisfaction of subjective desire must become the norm. In allowing the subjective to become the norm, the market recalibrates itself to respond against its own innate and objective interests to the extent they impose themselves upon the subjective norm. So long as the market may maintain the desire, and so long as it can access the raw material to provide the content to feed the desire, it may continue to grow according to subjective interest. Free market development, need-based market. As the subjective intent feeds the desire-based market, the objective intent, like the innate intent, feeds the need-based market. Innate intent is unconscious and is the expression of manifested form as limited by the balance of the evolved environment in which it exists. The evolving environment governs through providing a set of mutually reliant resources in the form of innately existing organisms. The organisms automatically express themselves according to their strengths and limitations. They feed from their environment to the extent they must in order to further evolve through regeneration. The need of each is governed by that which the raw environment in fact provides, such as to allow regeneration. The innate need-based market is distorted from inherent intent by the development of subjective intent, which manipulates the inherent balance towards subjective interest. Rational awareness reflects on the externalized costs of subjective intent on competing subjective intents, and later on the balance and therefore reliability of innate provisioning. Rational awareness requires subjective intent to be constrained in order to protect the provision of need. Need is constituted in that which is required to maintain the organism, whether individual or collective, collective being itself an individual within its environment, such that it may achieve its potential. Need applies to the maintenance of the manifested body of the organism. The maintenance of the manifested body is achieved through the securing of the nutrients required to feed the body that it can most effectively grow. It also requires the protection of that body from that which would undermine its ability to grow. The ability to grow to potential results in the heightening of evolutionary potential through regeneration. Effective growth towards potential requires efficiency in the functions of the inherent structure of the organism, as well as efficiency in the function of the expression of the organism in terms of content. By attending to inherent function of the organism, the market must comprehend that function and rank it according to value of purpose, so as to allocate precisely what is required and no more. The value of purpose is rated according to what is needed in order to play its role. To understand role, it is necessary to understand what the specific function supports and makes possible. Thus, the integrity of foundation must be established and maintained, such that what may be built upon it may be fundamentally resilient. Once the foundation is established, the remainder of provisioning potential is then directed to establishing and maintaining that which the foundation exists to allow. The foundation exists such that structure may grow from it. The structure must match the foundation in integrity of purpose. Integrity of purpose requires that no more be built than is required to achieve the growth of the content required to establish interactive potential towards objective intent. The structure thus must expand only to the extent reliably allowed by the established foundation. Where the foundation exceeds its need, the balance of the provisioning environment is weakened. To the extent the structure built extends beyond its foundation, the integrity of the structure is weakened. To the extent the content distracts from structural and foundational weakness, the organism undermines the integrity of the organism. Where the foundation is strong, in that no more of the provisioning environment is consumed than is necessary for innate and objective purpose, the integrity of the provisioning environment is maintained to the extent possible within the influence of the organism, such as to reliably provide for the regeneration of the organism. On that basis, the organism achieves the security by which to carefully consider the structure to be developed. The development of structure is dictated by innate function within the environment, and the maintenance of it is dictated by the need for efficiency if the potential is to be achieved. The development of content is designed to achieve integration of purpose towards collective objective potential. Evolution of control, developing desire. In the competition for resources and provision between the subjective desire-based market and the objective need-based market, the subjective recognizes the threat of the objective to its own subjective capacity in the temporal present. Where the development of the need-based market requires the foregoing of the consumption of immediately available resources in recognition of longer-term objective interests, the subjective, because it has not internalized objective principle, values what it knows to value, the development of reflective subjective identity, regardless of its alignment with objective principle. The development of desire through the feeding of desire shifts the market from actual need through the distorting of expectation. By calibrating the emotive mechanism to respond to consumption regardless of need, the subjective intent consumes provisioning resources to develop the structure required to give rise to content that is consumed regardless of its superfluity to innate and objective function. The emotive mechanism is powered by the innate survival instinct. In the innate environment, it develops automatically to recognize security and threat. The experience of it is integral to the evolved manifested form of the organism, in that it informs the organism within its environment of how to respond to its environment, and thus how to survive and reproduce within its environment. Where the organism develops reflective awareness and is able to manipulate its environment to protect its immediate security, the applied function of the emotive mechanism is diminished. Where rational awareness develops to apply controls to prevent threat from particular subjective intent, the applied function of the emotive mechanism is further diminished. The diminishment of the applied function of the emotive mechanism does not imply the weakening of the inherent latent force of the emotive mechanism, only the diminishment of its focused application as a result of increased security. The diminishment of its focused application is a result of the shifting of the organism to an over-reliance on the security of subjective achievement. In the context of the security provided by reflective manipulation, the organism maintains the experience of emotive response. Emotive response evolves in response to the environment it experiences, but the extent of its ultimate import remains rooted in the context of the survival mechanism which it developed to serve. The evolution of emotive response develops according to innate need within the environment, but as the environment shifts to the reflective, the calibration of innate need shifts from the raw environment to the collective environment. To the extent the collective environment is governed by subjective intent, the emotive mechanism shifts to respond to indicators in that environment. Those indicators are controlled by the subjective intents that dominate within the provisioning market and that the emotive organism relies on for its survival. At first, the indicators remain consistent with the form of the innate. The organism's reliance is formed through coercion resulting from the requirements of the structure that bear upon the survival and reproduction of the organism. Where the collective market develops, and where the subjective intent comes up against and competes with developing objective interest, then the subjective intent must counteract the objective intent for its own survival. The subjective intent is borne by all that exists as a result of its growth or is reliant on its growth. Through identification with the structure and content of the subjective intent, the emotive organism recognizes its own existence as being reliant on that structure and content. The subjective intent to save itself prevents the reallocation of collective purpose towards the objective through the manipulation of the emotive parameters of the organisms over which it holds influence. This manipulation can be acute or chronic. It can be acute through specific misinformation in a given circumstance. It is chronic where the subjective intent governs an entire environment, such that all that exists within the environment, gradually enough so as to avoid awareness, come to accept the subjective environment to the extent they lose contact with the purpose of innate structure and objective evolution. The overlooking of innate and objective need requires the emotive organism to focus on something that is sufficiently engaging to distract from the development of objective rationality. In the context of chronic manipulation, the emotive organism develops a subjective rationality, based in its emotive investment in the environment of the subjective intent, to justify its adherence despite evidence as to its lack of fundamental integrity. The emotive organism is encouraged to set its expectations according to the environment it knows. The environment it knows is structured by and provisioned with content by the subjective intent. The subjective intent then may control the emotive organism, both in terms of its action and in terms of its expectation. The emotive force of the emotive organism becomes part of the defensive posture of the subjective intent against the objective, where the objective poses a threat to the continuity of the subjective intent's control. Regardless of the will of subjective intent, or its success in manipulating the emotive mechanism to secure its purpose, the strength of the provisioning environment, in its infinite form, is inherently limited to the provisioning of innate and objective need. Where the subjective intent applies itself to building structure that extends beyond the integrity of its foundations, so as to provide content that encourages additional desire-based market growth, it develops an actual threat to all that grows to rely upon it. When the provisioning environment fails to provide as a result of overconsumption of resources, and when the growth fails as a result of being built without the necessary foundational support, the entire desire-based structure collapses. Evolution of control, managing for need. Objective intent reflects innate intent in its adherence to need. Where innate intent seeks to satisfy itself to the extent required within the raw provisioning environment, the objective intent seeks to satisfy itself to the extent required by the provisioning requirements within the environment of objective form. Objective intent competes with subjective intent for the finite resources of the innate environment and for influence over their use. Through internalization of rational awareness as a primary functional principle, the objective intent recognizes the provisioning environment to be finite where conformed to subjective intent, and potentially functionally infinite where conformed to innate and objective need. By limiting consumption within the environment to innate need, the resources of the environment are protected so as to secure the basis of provisioning by which the objective intent may be pursued. In securing the basis of innate provisioning, The objective intent allows the organism to extend its provisioning to include the content of objective forms. Through this extension, the collective organism governs itself towards efficiency in the pursuit of its potential. It seeks to establish the situation in which there is the greatest opportunity for development towards the objective. This requires the least use of resources for the greatest gain. It requires the protection of resources because it recognizes that it is through contemplation of the evolved environment that it may discover the structure on which its own development of objective understanding may be based. The objective need-based market thus protects the manifested diversity of its environment because it recognizes that consumption pertains not only to the requirements of the innate state. The mind of the organism must also consume, and while the content of the manifested environment sustains the body, the structure of it provides indications as to the formal basis by which the objectively minded organism may functionally develop towards heightened efficiency and towards the realization of increasingly distant objectives. The securing of the nutrients required by the body to grow requires a protection of the provisioning environment's ability to provide what is required. This means recognizing the requirement that in manipulating the environment to the interests of the organism must limit its manipulation so as to maintain the integrity of the provisioning ability. To limit manipulation, the organism must first prevent unnecessary manipulation. Unnecessary manipulation is all manipulation that is not required to provide the essential nutrients to feed the development of the body towards its potential. This requires limitations on two fronts. First, the protection of the provision of those essential nutrients through management of their consumption, and second, the prevention of manipulation that encourages consumption of that which is not required by innate or objective purpose. Second, the organism must prevent misguided response to necessary purpose. In the pursuit of the objective, the organism must carefully and continually consider the requirement of the objective and address itself to the determination of how to achieve it most efficiently. That is, through the least possible consumption and through controlled, directed consumption. Objective imagination, social, present application, government, societal framework, foundation for pursuit of interests. The structure that underlies the interactive content of the market incentivizes certain content and discourages other content. It does so according to the inherent intent resulting from the functional form of the structure of its manifestation. The functional form of the structure must be considered and designed if it is to provide the potential for content to meet the requirements of the objective. The objective requires a functional form that allows first its consideration and second its pursuit. The innate function is insufficient to allow the consideration of objective beyond the immediate. The magnification of intent, coupled with the abstraction that the development of rational consideration allows, provides the impetus and means by which the objective may be brought into consciousness and pursued. Governance is the regulation of threat to the organism. Initially, the innate organism governs threat through its inherent characteristics. It defends its access to resources in its environment to the extent it can. The inherent bodily characteristics by which the innate mechanism defends itself include an inherent internal system of defense against micro-threats such as pathogens, and inherent external systems of defense against macro-threats such as climactic stressors and predators. As the organism develops reflective awareness, it recognizes its ability to manipulate its environment and does so to increase its security against the threats of which it is aware. To the extent the organism is successful, it realizes the potentially exponential subjective benefit gained from the security it produces, first for itself and then crucially for others. By leveraging the security provided to others, the organism increases its own security, which justifies its manipulation. The organism takes on the role of a provisioning entity for those to which it provides security. In taking on the role of a provisioning entity, and by securing its own subjective position through that role, the organism develops reliance on the role, both in itself and on those that are provisioned with security. Until the provisioning entity has itself internalized the necessity to govern itself according to rational principle, the reliance placed on it creates a risk that develops to mirror the extent of the import of the reliance. Reliance is the receipt and acceptance of influence according to the terms of the provisioning entity. The terms placed upon provisioning in the innate environment are inherent and automatic as a result of comparative functional characteristics of interacting and competing organisms within the innate environment. In the subjective context, The terms for provisioning have the potential to develop to be arbitrary. They may develop to have no functional purpose beyond the development and maintenance of reliance on the provisioning subjective organism. This lack of functional purpose may apply to the needs of the innate functionality of the organism within the wider provisioning environment, and to the extent that terms remove consideration from innate functional purpose, they are corrosive both to the provisioned organism and to the wider provisioning environment. By diminishing consideration of innate functional purpose and of the wider provisioning environment, the provisioning organism redirects resource from efficient intent to inefficient intent. To the extent the subjective provisioning entity causes the provisioned entity to recalibrate its expectation from objective need to subjective need, friction is created between the subjective and innate intents, between competing subjective intents, and between subjective and objective intent. Where the discrepancy grows to the extent it becomes systematic in an environment and reaches to conflict with other subjective intents that do not accept the offered terms, the inefficiency is realized. Where inefficiency is realized, either the system fails or the rational element develops to counteract the cause through the development of governing structure to promote efficient interaction. The governing structure is as extensive as that which is taken into account by its intent. At first, it is a rational response to pre-existing conditions. It is, in that initial case, purely reactionary, with conceptions staged upon recognition of the potential for clear immediate harm. Later, it may develop with objective consideration to instigate the growth of certain behavior that not only removes the immediate threat, but also diminishes the probability of the threat developing again. Through the channeling of behavior by rule, the governing force instigates a recalibration of the emotive response mechanism. The longer the rule is followed, the more normal the state of its requirements become to the affected organism, and the more the expectations of the organism shift to align with the conditions brought about by the following of the rule. Where the rule is aligned with innate and objective purpose, it satisfies the innate requirements of the affected organism, while aligning the affected organism to invest its intent towards outcomes that continue to prove relevant and which increase in relevance. Rules, where objectively oriented, are the applications of principle to manifested behavior. Only through application of rules to create norms consistent with the principle can the principle become apparent. The principle becomes apparent through the consideration of abstract pattern within the diversity of manifested existence. The successful institution of rules allows the intent they collectively represent to become apparent. The calibration of the emotive mechanism to the intent they represent is the internalization of the intent they represent. The intent becomes the expectation, and the consideration of the expectation allows the recognition of the principle that underlies it. The role of governance is to promote the internalization of an objective principle, so as to create an efficient collective that is focused on the achievement of the always greater objective. The establishment of an interactive environment that is sufficiently stable in provision to allow the internalization of the intent of rules, such as to allow consideration of the principle the rules represent, positions the affected organism to develop its own awareness of principle in the immediate and thereby to develop awareness of principle in the abstract. Government, societal framework, influence on pursuit of interests. Once the individualized awareness of principle is developed through the calibration of the emotive response mechanism towards objective purpose, the governing intent of the collective may diminish the specificity of rules so as to allow individuation through the reliance on internalized principle alone for governance. This evolved state provides the security that is necessary to allow individualized pursuit of interests, with decreased concern for the distortion that arises as a result of subjective intent that is not aligned with innate or objective need. In the innate state, the intent powering the evolution of organisms seeks to achieve its potential of expression to the extent allowed by the functional allowances and requirements of the provisioning environment. In the objective state, the same holds true. The provisioning environment, whether innate, subjective, or objective, provides a structure that guides growth within the environment. Where consistent with the guiding intent, the growth is allowed. The shift from the innate to the subjective represents a shift of guiding intent from body to mind. The shift from the subjective to the objective represents a shift of guiding intent from mind to spirit. Within the subjective context, the mind develops awareness of its potential for influence over the body, and the awareness of the need to rationally govern through calibration the emotive response mechanism. In developing the ability to apply rationality, the organism recognizes the patterns according to which the body functions within the innate environment and the role of the emotive response mechanism in sustaining that function. The recognition of those patterns gives rise to awareness of the principles of intent the patterns represent. The core of individualized spirit is fundamental objective intent. Individualized spirit cannot therefore be triggered through subjective intent. Subjective intent limits the affected organism from consideration of its own core intent. Subjective intent distracts from fundamental objective intent through triggering the digression of interest towards a fluctuating state of emotive response in the context of subjective triggers that, because coerced, may only be governed through the imposition of rule-based structures. By distracting the affected organism with a constant fluctuation of triggered emotive responses, the subjective intent maintains the coerced allegiance of the organism and prevents the consistency of security that would allow the development of the affected organism to achieve direct internalization of objective principle, the realization of individualized objective spirit. The pursuit of individualized objective is at the core of the graduation of the organism from externally coerced subjective interest to the internally driven objective interest that is the core requirement for the satisfaction of individualized purpose. Societal protection, domestic conflict. The pursuit of individualized objective towards the principle-based diversity of awareness that represents the realized objective potential of the organism must be protected if it is to be realized. Threats that arise must be contained with a sternness to match the solemnity of the purpose to be protected. These threats can be internally or externally based. Internally based threats are those that arise out of the allowed subjective intent of the organism itself. They arise out of inertia, out of the impulse to rest as a result of achieved security. And they arise out of trauma, out of the impulse to regress as a result of lost security. The potential for inertia to manifest increases after surges of overall success in the achievement of security, or in the relative success that arises in the aftermath of acute decreases in security. In both cases, it arrives as a result of acute difference. In the case of surges of overall success, the organism experiences levels of security that are sufficiently greater than what was previously known as to have the effect of diminishing the organism's consideration of threat as a continually present entity. In such a case, the surge of success transcends the extent of the organism's expectation. The success approaches the extent of the organism's awareness of objective potential. As a result, the emotive parameters of the organism shift to reflect the degree of its satisfaction with the current state in comparison to the previous state. In the case of success in the aftermath of acute decreases in security, the organism's parameters shift due to the proximity of the recent weakening event. The relief of the organism from the strain of the weakening event, depending on the extent of the weakening, has the potential to give rise to satisfaction with a state that is not comparable even to previously attained states of security, let alone the extent of previously conceived objective potential. The proximity of the weakening event causes the organism to compare the current state with the recent state, instead of with the state it knows both through experience and through conception to be possible. Where the acute decrease in security is sufficiently impactful as to cause an actual shift towards a subjective recognition of the triggered innate survival mechanism, it causes trauma. The organism associates the trauma to the previous state, and its emotive response mechanism, in its most innate survivalist sense, arises to warn the organism. When the innate survival mechanism arises, it attaches to all that the organism is, and is magnified above the innate to the extent of that expression. The organism then retracts from that which it associates with the threat it experienced. In retracting, the organism diminishes its intent from its previous state to the state at which it feels secure. In each case, the shift constitutes an internally reactive decrease in the extent of intent relative to current position from that previously achieved. Where that decrease is considerable, it can constitute a return from principle-based collective intent to the necessity for rule-based governance of subjective intent. The diminishment constitutes internal corrosion of the individual potential to realize the objective state, and thereby a corrosion of the objective integrity of the collective intent. The corrosion of the objective integrity of the collective intent weakens the resilience of the organism and increases its susceptibility to further weakening, including as a result of externally based threats. Societal protection, international conflict. The organism, whether in the innate state, the subjective state, or the objective state, is susceptible to the intent of the environment to the extent its integrity will allow. To the extent integrity diminishes, the force of external intent may encroach. The integrity of the organism is the force of its individualized intent towards the objective. The integrity of the collective organism is the force of the combined individualized intent towards the objective. Individualized intent is most powerful when it is consistent rather than coerced. The potential for coercion from individualized intent is the measure of vulnerability in the organism. In the subjective state, where the emotive mechanism is most exposed, the individual is most vulnerable because the power of intent applicable to the evolved state of the reflective mind is at stake. In the objective state, the organism may see past its immediate subjective state to allow measured response anchored in objective intent. The organism's guide point is sufficiently abstracted that it may judge and hold at bay the intent of that which would detract from the organism's objective purpose. By establishing a consistent state of collective, individually realized objective intent, the collective organism achieves its most resilient state. In reaching that state, the collective organism confronts external threats with the sternness of its solemn duty to protect its interest in its own determination of objective need. The collective organism, firm from micro to macro in resolve, must determine its interests according to the principles that define the objective. First among those is protection of pre-existing objective intent to the extent it is not superseded by evolved objective intent resulting from increases in objective awareness. Once those interests are determined, the collective organism must establish itself to empower its ability to achieve those objectives and to disempower that which would prevent it from achieving those objectives. The first step is to realize consistency of individualized intent through calibration of the emotive response mechanism to the realized state as informed by the trajectory of objective purpose. Then the organism must apply that evolved, objectively purposed and individualized emotive response mechanism in the context of environmental awareness and apply rational consideration to the information it provides. To the extent the organism has internalized the objective, such that it has calibrated its emotive response mechanism to the requirements of the objective rather than to its own currently or previously perceived requirements, the organism will be able to consider external forces according to the extent of the consistency of objective. To the extent external intents are consistent with the organism's own objective intent, the organism may allow wariness to be alleviated and may benefit from the interaction to the extent of expanding the individualized collective. To the extent external intents are subjectively based, the integrity of the organism's objective intent must be guarded with stern rigor. The threat is to the loss of the individualization within the collective. Objective imagination. Social. Conclusion. The consideration of the interactive state requires consideration of the current state of capacity and potential. In order to comprehend the current state of capacity, the organism must develop the means to reliably take account of its provisioning environment and its requirements within that environment. This process must first instigate humility in the separation of objective understanding from subjective understanding. Then it must include analysis of the interconnectedness of the environment and the recognition of the importance of maintaining the integrity of that interconnectedness in the preservation of the environment's ability to supply what is required by the organism. From its understanding of the current state of capacity, the organism may consider the potential of what may be achieved based on the state of current capacity and the means by which to prioritize development in light of the provisioning potential of the environment. In the prioritization and manifestation of development, the organism must take account of the competition between subjective and objective intent in the individual and collective contexts. Further, the organism must manage those interests so as to establish reliance on individualized internalization of objective principle for the maintenance of the collective state. To manage those interests within the context of interaction within the collective, the individual organism must develop its ability for expression and communication. Expression requires the development of structure and content. Communication requires empathetic consideration of the position of that with which the organism interacts, so that meshing of interest towards objective principle may occur on an increasingly collective scale. Once the organism has considered the current interactive state of capacity and potential according to rational process, it is in a position to determine its intent in the development of the evolution of the collective organism. The development of the evolution of the collective organism takes place in the competitive market, where subjective intents conflict, and where objective intent must develop if the organism's evolutionary development is to be sustained. The subjective intent contrives against the limitations of innate and objective needs to harness the emotive response mechanism to develop expectation within the market for desire-based provisioning. The objective intent employs a rational control mechanism to protect against the development of the subjective market, both in order to preserve the integrity of the provisioning environment and in order to establish the ability, through recalibration of the emotive response mechanism according to rational principle, to develop objective awareness and thereby intent towards need-based provisioning. The establishment of objective intent and the channeling of resources is accomplished through mechanisms of governance, by establishing structures that increase the potential for objective consideration. In the subjective environment, these structures must be constituted by rules. Through the establishment of rules, the subjective is brought into alignment with objective principle without the need for individualized internalization of principle. Through continuity and consistency of rule, the emotive mechanism recalibrates to the environment as it is known. With the recalibration, the organism internalizes the manifested state and the principle that is expressed through the manifested state. Once the organism has internalized the principle, it has the potential to act according to the principle. This allows the development of a principle-based collective in which the imposition of rules may be diminished. The consistent collective intent may then be employed with the efficiency of integration and with the resilience of concerted active intent to strive for further objective development.